Her small, trembling hands latched onto the expensive fabric of his black suit jacket. They took her. They kidnapped my mama. The entire restaurant went deathly quiet. Silverware clattered against fine china. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Because the man this child was desperately clinging to, was the most dangerous shadow in the city. And the decision he made in that moment would become a legend that whispered through the streets of Chicago forever. The atmosphere inside Leclerc was thick with the scent of aged scotch and the heavy silence of men who knew better than to speak out of turn. At the center of it all sat a man whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, a man with a mask of granite and a past etched in the ink on his skin. For 20 years, he had lived by a singular, frozen truth: feelings were a liability, and a heart was just a target. He had built an empire on the ironclad rule that you never let anyone in. Nothing had ever dared to disturb his peace or breach his perimeter. Until the heavy oak doors were thrown wide, and a little girl in a torn red dress ran past the world's most elite security, heading straight for the Black Lion himself. Gino Marcello did not merely occupy the head of the table at Leclerc, he was the gravity that held the room together. At 48, he was a man carved from shadow and cold obsidian, possessing a stillness that was far more terrifying than any display of rage. To the city of Chicago, he was the Black Lion, a predator who had survived decades of urban warfare by excelling at one specific discipline: the absolute suppression of his own humanity. He sat beneath the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers, the silk of his black suit absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Across from him, two of his top enforcers were mid-report, their voices kept to a practiced whisper. Gino didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed on the condensation trailing down his glass of untouched scotch, his mind a fortress of logistics and territorial borders. For Gino, the world was a series of cold calculations. Sentiment was a leak in the pipes, a structural weakness that led to collapse. He had seen men destroyed by their own hearts, and he had vowed long ago that no such crack would ever form in his foundation. The visible ink of a sprawling tattoo crept up from beneath his crisp collar, a permanent reminder of the violence he had both survived and dealt. In the underworld, his reputation was one of surgical precision. He didn't believe in unnecessary cruelty, but he believed in absolute consequences. If a debt was owed, it was collected. If a promise was broken, the offender was erased. This predictability was why he was feared, and why the restaurant, despite being at full capacity, felt like a tomb. The wealthy socialites at the perimeter tables spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the corner where the lion sat, terrified of making a sound that might draw his attention. He was a man who moved through life as if he were already dead, a ghost presiding over a kingdom of concrete. There was no warmth in his smile, because he never smiled. There was no mercy in his eyes, because mercy was a currency he had stopped spending the day he realized that the world gives nothing back. He was the master of his domain, untouchable and utterly alone, a king who had traded his soul for a throne of ice. He expected the night to end as it always did, with a silent nod, a heavy tip, and a lonely drive back to a house that felt more like a vault than a home. He had no way of knowing that the silence he had perfected for 20 years was about to be shattered by the one thing he couldn't calculate, the desperate, unrefined scream of a child who didn't know enough to be afraid of him. The heavy silence that followed Julie's plea was not the silence of peace, but the suffocating vacuum that precedes a storm. Gino Marcello did not flinch, but his grip on his scotch glass tightened until his knuckles turned as white as the linens covering the table. He looked down at the small girl, her curly blonde hair a chaotic mess of gold against the dark backdrop of the restaurant. Julie's chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths, her eyes searching his stern face for a spark of something, mercy, recognition, or perhaps just a sign that he was as powerful as her mother had whispered. "Slow down," Gino said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that somehow cut through her hysteria. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out with one large, scarred hand and cupped her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Who took her, Julie? And where?" The words poured out of her then, a desperate, fragmented testimony of the last hour. She spoke of a black van with sliding doors that had pulled up beside their small apartment on the outskirts of the district. She described men with cold eyes and snakes on their arms, a detail that caused Gino's lieutenants to exchange a sharp, knowing glance. It was the mark of a crew operating outside the established families, a group of predators who didn't care for the old codes of territory or conduct. Julie recounted how Doris, her mother, had shoved her behind a dumpster and told her to run to the restaurant with the gold lion on the door. She told me a man named Gino would know what to do, the girl sobbed, her small fingers twisting the fabric of his black shirt. She said you were the only one who wasn't afraid of the dark. The diners in the background watched in a trance of terror and fascination. They saw the Black Lion of Chicago, a man who had ordered the disappearance of rivals without blinking, lean in closer to the child. The snakes Julie described were the calling cards of a trafficking ring Gino had been tracking for weeks, a cancer that had begun to grow in the shadows of his city. By taking Doris J. Shaw, they hadn't just committed a kidnapping. They had reached into Gino's world and touched something he thought he had buried 30 years ago, a sense of duty to the innocent. Gino stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor like a gunshot. He didn't look at his men, but they were already reaching for their coats, the air in Leclet shifting from expensive luxury to the cold, metallic scent of an impending hunt. He looked down at Julie, his expression still a mask of stone, but his hand lingered on her shoulder for a second too long to be accidental. "Stay here with the manager," he commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I'm going to go find your mother." Gino stood at the center of the hushed restaurant, his silhouette casting a long, jagged shadow over the white linen tables. To his men, he was a strategist calculating his next move; to the diners, he was a monster awakened. But inside the vault of his own mind, Gino was no longer in the present. The mention of Doris J. Shaw and her desperate instruction to find the man who wasn't afraid of the dark had bypassed his armor, striking a nerve he had spent 2 decades trying to kill. He looked down at his own hands, large, powerful, and stained by a history of necessary evils, and then at the small, fragile fingers of Julie E. Swank still tucked into his palm. A flash of a memory, sharp and unbidden, tore through him. A woman's face, a scream silenced by the roar of an engine, and the heavy, suffocating weight of failing to protect the only person who had ever looked at him with love. He had been younger then, a soldier who hadn't been fast enough. He had spent the rest of his life ensuring he would never be weak again, but in doing so, he had become a statue of salt. The debt of conscience was not a financial one, it was a ghost. Doris had worked the late shift at a diner Gino frequented when he wanted to disappear from his own life. She had served him coffee in silence, never asking questions about the blood on his cuffs or the darkness in his eyes. Once, years ago, when he had been wounded and delirious, she had hidden him in a back room while the sirens wailed past, asking for nothing in return. She had treated him like a man instead of a myth. Gino realized now that Doris had kept his secret, and in return, she had believed in a version of him that didn't actually exist, a hero hiding under the skin of a villain. Looking at Julie's tear-streaked face, he felt the cold ice around his heart crack. If he let this child lose her mother, he wouldn't just be losing a civilian, he would be confirming that the Black Lion was truly as hollow as the city feared. He turned to his lead enforcer, Marco, his voice coming out like grinding stone. "Cancel the shipment at the docks. I want every set of eyes we own on that black van. If so much as a hair on Doris's head is harmed, I will burn this city to the ground to find the ash." The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a focused, lethal intent. He wasn't just protecting his territory anymore, he was fighting for the one shred of humanity he had left. The doors of Leclet had barely clicked shut behind Gino before the city of Chicago began to vibrate with a new, dangerous frequency. He stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, the neon lights of the theater district reflecting in the polished black hood of his sedan like jagged streaks of lightning. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for his phone. For the Black Lion, the most lethal tool in his arsenal was not lead, but information. With a few clipped commands, a silent signal rippled through the dark veins of the city. In smoke-filled pool halls, high-rise security offices, and derelict basement bars, men who usually feared the light suddenly stood at attention. The order was absolute: find the black van with the serpent mark. Within minutes, the vast, invisible machinery of Gino's empire was grinding into motion. This wasn't a standard hit or a territorial dispute, it was a total mobilization. Traffic camera feeds were hijacked by silent hackers in Gino's employ, and street-level lookouts. Men who usually traded in secrets and stolen goods, were promised a king's ransom for a single location. Gino sat in the back of his moving car, his face illuminated by the passing street lamps, looking like a statue of ancient, vengeful bronze. Beside him, Marco worked a tablet, coordinating the search grids. "We have a sighting near the old industrial canal," Marco muttered, his voice tense. The van was spotted heading south toward the shipyards. "It's the snakes, boss. They're moving fast." Gino's jaw tightened. He knew that area, a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses where sounds were swallowed by the wind off the lake. It was the perfect place to make a person disappear forever. He thought of Doris, a woman who had once offered him kindness when he was nothing but a bleeding ghost, and he felt a cold, predatory heat rising in his chest. He wasn't just a businessman tonight. He was a hunter. "Tell the units to converge, but no sirens," Gino commanded, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon of the city. "I want them trapped before they even know the lion is out of his cage. And tell them if they lay a hand on her before I arrive, there won't be enough of them left to bury." The car surged forward, weaving through the midnight traffic with a singular, lethal purpose. The underworld was no longer just a place of profit. It had become a dragnet, and the men who had taken Doris Shaw were about to realize they had kidnapped the ward of a man who owned the very shadows they were trying to hide in. The rain turned from a drizzle into a relentless gray curtain, blurring the neon geometry of the Chicago skyline as Gino's sedan tore through the south side. Inside the car, the only light came from the rhythmic sweep of street lamps and the cold, blue glow of Marco's tablet. The digital map was a web of pulsing red lines, each one representing a data point squeezed from the city's terrified underworld. They were no longer just looking for a vehicle, they were following a trail of broken glass and desperate choices. "We lost the tail at 47th, Marco muttered, his thumb tracing a frantic path over the screen. But a lookout at a 24-hour garage saw a black Econoline jumping the curb to avoid a patrol car. "They're heading toward the Calumet River. If they reach the international terminal, they can move her onto a freighter before the sun comes up." Gino didn't respond with words. He simply leaned forward and tapped the driver's shoulder, a silent command that sent the needle on the speedometer climbing toward triple digits. His mind was a map of its own, cataloging the rusted-out skeletons of the old steel mills and the jagged piers that lined the water. He knew exactly where a man with a snake tattoo would feel safe. Somewhere the police wouldn't venture without a riot squad, and somewhere a scream would be drowned out by the groan of heavy machinery. As they neared the industrial district, the scenery shifted from brick apartments to towering silos and mountains of scrap metal. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel and stagnant river water. Then, Marco straightened up, his eyes widening. "Signal intercepted. One of our street-level guys just pinged a GPS tag he managed to slap on their bumper while they were stalled at a drawbridge. They're at Pier 14. An abandoned grain elevator." Gino's eyes narrowed, reflecting the predatory amber of the distant shipyard lights. Pier 14 was a graveyard of industry, a place where the city's law ended and his began. He could see it now in the distance. A hulking shadow of concrete and iron, and parked right beneath the rusted loading bay was the dull silhouette of the black van. "Kill the lights," Gino commanded, his voice as sharp as a razor. The sedan went dark, coasting like a ghost into the labyrinth of shipping containers. He checked the weight of the handgun at his hip, but his mind stayed on the memory of Julie's small, shaking hands. He wasn't just here to settle a territorial dispute anymore. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. The Black Lion had reached the mouth of the cave, and he wasn't planning on leaving until the shadows gave back what they had stolen. The sedan glided to a halt in the deep shadows of a rusted iron gantry, its engine cooling with a series of metallic clicks that sounded like a countdown. Gino Marcello stepped out into the biting river wind, his black wool coat snapping around his legs. He didn't look at the hulking grain elevator. His eyes were fixed on the black van, now illuminated by a flickering security light. As he approached, the side door of the vehicle hung open, revealing a discarded medical kit and a single, mud-caked sneaker that he recognized from Julie's frantic description. Marco moved to his side, holding a handheld scanner that hummed with a low-frequency grit. "Boss, we pulled the registration on the VIN. It's a ghost vehicle, but the encrypted comms we intercepted just hit a match on our internal database." Marco's voice wavered, a rare fracture in his professional veneer. "It's not just a street crew. The lead signature belongs to Elias Vane." Gino stopped mid-stride, his face hardening into a mask of pure, lethal frost. Vane was a name that belonged to the darkest corners of the international circuit. A man who didn't just kidnap for ransom, but for a global network of shadows where victims were never heard from again. Vane was a scavenger who prided himself on being a ghost, but he had made a fatal error. He had mistaken Doris Shaw for a nameless nobody and Gino's city for an unguarded playground. The realization of who they were facing changed the weight of the air. This wasn't a local shakedown or a simple mistake of identity. Vane was a professional who moved his cargo within hours. If Gino had waited even 20 more minutes at the restaurant, Doris would have been on a container ship, lost to a world of no return. The stakes had shifted from a rescue to a war. For Gino, the identity of the kidnapper stripped away the last of his cold calculations. Vane represented everything Gino had spent his life trying to keep out of Chicago, a breed of cruelty that lacked even the twisted honor of the Mafia codes. He looked at the towering concrete silos of the elevator, knowing Vane's men would be perched in the rafters with high-caliber rifles. But Gino didn't reach for a bulletproof vest. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze burning with a predatory fire. "Vane thinks he's a ghost because he only fights people who are afraid to die," Gino whispered, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the river barges. "He's about to find out what happens when he touches something that belongs to the lion." With a slow, deliberate motion, Gino drew a heavy suppressed pistol from his holster, the weight of Doris's life and Julie's hope resting entirely on his steady hand. The time for tracing was over. The time for the kill had arrived. Gino Marcello didn't give a signal, he simply became the shadows. He moved toward the grain elevator with the predatory grace of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the architecture of violence. Behind him, his team fanned out into a tactical crescent, their movements silent, synchronized, and lethal. The air inside the structure was freezing, smelling of ancient dust and the metallic tang of river salt. High above, the rhythmic drip of a leaking pipe echoed like a slow-beating heart. A flash of movement on the third-floor catwalk triggered Gino's instincts. He didn't wait for the muzzle flash. He squeezed the trigger of his suppressed pistol twice. The cough of the weapon was barely audible over the wind, followed by the heavy thud of a lookout collapsing against the corrugated steel. Gino climbed the rusted spiral stairs, his boots making no sound on the metal. Every level he cleared brought him closer to the source of the low, guttural voices echoing from the top floor. He reached the primary loading deck, a vast open space cluttered with rotted wooden crates and discarded machinery. In the center, illuminated by a single, harsh halogen work light, was Doris Shaw. She was bound to a heavy iron chair, her face bruised but her eyes defiant even as Elias Vane leaned into her space, his snake tattoo coiling around his neck like a noose. Vane was checking a heavy steel watch, his expression that of a man bored by the logistics of his own cruelty. "The transport is 10 minutes out," Vane rasped, oblivious to the wolf at the door. "Make sure she's sedated. We can't have her making a scene at the terminal." Gino stepped out of the darkness, the barrel of his weapon leveled at Vane's heart. The suddenness of his appearance caused the two guards near the hoist to freeze, their hands hovering over their holsters. The Black Lion didn't look like a businessman anymore, he looked like an ancient deity of retribution. "The transport isn't coming, Elias," Gino said, his voice a jagged edge of ice that seemed to drop the temperature of the room. "And the only one leaving this building tonight is the woman." Vane spun around, a sneer twisting his features as he realized who had breached his sanctuary. For a heartbeat, the entire room was suspended in a state of terminal tension. Then, the silence shattered. Gino's team breached the skylights and the side exits simultaneously, a coordinated storm of precision fire and overwhelming force. In the chaos, Gino didn't look for cover. He moved directly toward Doris, his eyes locked on her, a man walking through a hurricane to save a single candle from going out. The warehouse became a theater of absolute silence as the gunfire ceased, leaving only the sharp scent of cordite and the low groan of the wind through the grain chutes. Gino Marcello stepped over the fallen forms of Vane's mercenaries, his focus narrowed entirely on Elias Vane. The kidnapper was backed against a rusted pylon, his hand hovering near a weapon he knew he was too slow to draw. Gino stopped 5 feet away, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the concrete, a mirror image of the man he had spent 20 years trying to forget. "You think we're different, don't you, Gino?" Vane spat, a desperate, bloody grin twisting his face. "You sit in your high-end restaurants and play at being a businessman, but you and I, we both trade in the dark. We both take what we want. I just don't pretend to have a soul." Gino looked at Vane, but he saw a ghost. He saw the man he might have become if he hadn't let Julie's small hands touch his sleeve. He saw the cold, hollow vacuum of a life lived without a single tether to the living. For a heartbeat, the Black Lion felt the familiar pull of the abyss, the urge to simply end the nuisance and walk away, leaving another body for the river to claim. It would be the easy choice, the one the old Gino would have made without a second thought. But then he heard a small, muffled sob. Doris Shaw was watching him, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. She wasn't just looking at her savior, she was looking at a man standing on the edge of a moral precipice. If Gino executed Vane in cold blood here, he would be confirming every word the villain had just spoken. He would be returning to Julie not as a protector, but as the monster the world believed him to be. Gino slowly lowered his weapon. The tension in his shoulders, a weight he had carried for 2 decades, seemed to shift. "You're right, Elias," Gino said, his voice devoid of its usual frost, replaced by a weary, heavy clarity. "We are the same. Or we were. But a child reminded me tonight that I still have a choice. You don't." He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he signaled to Marco, who stepped forward with a pair of heavy zip ties. "Turn him over to the feds," Gino commanded, never taking his eyes off Vane. "Give them the encrypted drive we found in the van. I want him to spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, forgotten by the world he tried to prey on." Gino turned his back on the villain, crossing the floor to where Doris sat. As he cut her bonds, his hands, the same hands that had built an empire of fear, were steady and surprisingly gentle. He wasn't just freeing a captive, he was finally breaking the chains of his own history. The mirror had been shattered, and for the first time in his life, Gino Marcello recognized the man looking back at him. The drive back to the city was silent, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a man trapped in a vault. Doris Shaw sat in the back of the darkened sedan, her hand clutching Gino's sleeve, not in terror, but as an anchor. As the car pulled up to the curb of the quiet street where Julie waited, the dawn was just beginning to break, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of soft rose and gold. The Black Lion stepped out first, his movements slow and weary, the adrenaline of the hunt finally giving way to a profound, quiet clarity. Julie was standing on the sidewalk, a small, solitary figure in a torn red dress, guarded by 2 of Gino's most trusted men who had stood watch all night. When she saw the car, she didn't hesitate. She ran with a burst of pure, kinetic joy, her blonde curls catching the first light of the sun. But she didn't run to Gino first. She threw herself into her mother's arms as Doris collapsed onto the pavement to meet her, the two of them becoming a single, sobbing knot of reclaimed life. Gino stood back in the shadows of the doorway, watching the reunion with a face that remained stone still, though his eyes lacked their usual predatory glint. He realized then that his power hadn't been defined by the empire he built or the enemies he broke, but by this single, quiet moment of safety he had authored. He had spent 20 years believing that to be a king meant to be feared, but as Julie looked up from her mother's shoulder and offered him a small, tearful nod of thanks, he felt a warmth that no amount of scotch or status could ever provide. 6 months later, the whispers in the underworld had changed. They still spoke of Gino Marcello's reach, but they also spoke of the Golden Lion, who had cleared the south side of the predators who preyed on the weak. Gino still sat at the head of the table at Leclerc, and he still wore the black suit of a man who ruled the shadows, but every Tuesday afternoon, a small girl in a clean red dress could be seen entering his office with a drawing or a story from school. Gino hadn't walked away from his world, but he had changed the rules of his kingdom. He was the hero they didn't expect, a man who had found his soul in the trembling hands of a child. He was no longer a ghost presiding over a vault, he was a protector, a man who had finally learned that the greatest strength wasn't the ability to take a life, but the courage to cherish one. The Black Lion had finally come home.